right? Thanking and praising God for the way in which his counsel can keep us away from unnecessary disappointment. Let's look at that relatively familiar theme through the lens of practice, a theme that I think will carry us all the way through this final book of the Old Covenant, the book of Malachi, understanding that his people have gotten themselves into some practices that are frustrating both them and God, as they are viewing their service to God as seemingly pointless. Understanding that, though, Malachi's 4 chapters can probably be described or summarized in a number of ways, but the way that stood out most to me looks at the perspective of chapter 1, describing God's name and the way that their practices have begun to drag it basically down, for lack of a better term. Chapter 2, talking about his covenant and likewise the way in which their practices are starting to diminish the value of the covenant he had, particularly with the people of the tribe of Levi, his priests. And chapter 3 is going to talk about the way in which his messenger is going to restore all that has been lost in the friction between God and his people, at this point seeming to be the remnant, at least with the timelines I've seen, where Malachi falls in the history of Israel. But all that aside, chapter 4 is going to talk about better days ahead, understanding that there are some who are actually going to listen to what God has had to say, and they have done enough work on themselves to say that there are some changes that we actually believe can reduce the level of frustration that we are experiencing in life right now. With that, chapter 1 is going to basically be a great representation of most of the book of Malachi, understanding that the distance between God and his people is going to be super similar to the distance between God and his people that Jesus is going to describe in the Sermon on the Mount when he uses a familiar pattern saying, "You have heard, but I say to you," correcting the misinterpretations or misapplications of the law that were popular in his day. It seems that that might have been a thing all the way back here in Malachi with, like we said, quite possibly the remnant or those he was starting the nation over with after the exile, as he is going to identify some things that are going wrong with them and contrast them with a "but you say" or "but you," followed by what they actually believe about the situation. In that regard, chapter 1 is going to seem to be broken up in roughly 3 paragraphs. One is just the first verse saying that this is the oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. The second paragraph, at least in the ESV, going from verses 2 through 5 with that first "but you say" statement. Verse 2 saying, "I have loved you, says the Lord, but you say, how have you loved us?" In a relatively famous line that goes on to explain, "Jacob I loved, but Esau I have hated." Understanding that they both had strayed, sinned, just been shady in some ways, but he was still giving Jacob or Israel opportunities that he had not given Esau, understanding that it doesn't just seem like it's at random, like he's playing favorites, but it seems as though Esau has descended to a point at which they have been, by the time we get to verse 4, identified by reputation as the wicked country and the people with whom the Lord is angry forever. And so with that, he is going to use that as an illustration of, as bad as it seems, at least you aren't there yet. Going on, though, he's going to say in verses 6 through the end of the chapter, at least, once again, that's the paragraph break or structure that the ESV uses. There are going to be a number of thoughts that are going to be summed up once again in that "but you say" format, where he is going to say, "I am a father," me summarizing, but seems to be a father without honor whose name is despised, particularly by the priests, at which point in verse 6 is going to contrast, saying, "But you say, how have we despised your name?" At which point verse 7 is going to say, "By offering polluted food upon my altar." At which point they're going to say, "But you say, how have we polluted you?" By saying that the Lord's table may be despised, at which point he's going to identify the way in which they're pretty much just using his counsel as a bunch of suggestions, or his standards. They're going to look at them as a bunch of suggestions, leading them to offer kind of their leftovers, the blind, the lame, and the sick among the animals, as acceptable sacrifices that God should be happy with, going all the way back to the distinction between Cain and Abel, not specifically stated, but seeming that Abel gave his best, maybe, or at least a more acceptable sacrifice, it's going to say, than Cain, who was rebuked for not doing well in what he offered. Going on, though, it's going to talk about the way that if they simply improve their level or their output, God will show favor to them, verse 9. But he's going to say that until then, he just wants somebody to close the door to keep them from offering whatever it is that they think is acceptable. Understanding that by the time we get to the end of the chapter, it would be one thing if they were simply looking at God's standards as suggestions and producing excellence, but they're taking his standards as suggestions and producing something that we might call, or some might call, ratchet, or just budget, or just it's not quality. And so with that, he is no longer going to have his name drugged because of the ratchetness produced by his people. And so with that, verse 11 is going to talk about the way in which he is going to restore his name or his reputation. However, verse 13 is going to give us another "but you say," when they say, "What a weariness it," my paraphrase, "already is to serve him." Understanding that by the time we get to the end of the chapter in verse 14, they seem like their frustration might be rooted in their expectation that they should be getting the best out of life from a mediocre effort. But verse 14, in my paraphrase, seems to show God promising them that their mediocre effort is only cursing their potential, reminding me of something I heard from a friend, a former missionary back in the day. We used to play ball together, and as we were practicing going into an intramural game, I said a familiar cliche: practice makes perfect. And a friend corrected me accurately by saying, "No, Marcus, perfect practice makes perfect." A lesson that has stuck with me to this day, a lesson that I thank that friend for, because he was helping me to understand the thing standing between me and my potential was practicing bad habits, helping me to also understand a lot of my frustration over time in it's seeming to take so long to improve and really never get to where I was going. In my heart, realizing I could just be a whole lot better than I was right then. Why? Because I've been better in the past and I just wasn't figuring it out. And so with that one bit of advice, that one small correction, my friend helped me to understand one of the things that I think God is trying to get his people to understand here. A lot of their frustration in their service to God and in their life in general had a lot to do with the watered down standards they had accepted for themselves. And over time, the way in which they began to assume that God should bless their faulty habits, an assumption that God is going to correct in the next chapter, starting with his priests.